book, A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn writes, "By the time I began teaching and writing, I had no illusions about objectivity, if that meant avoiding a point of view. I knew that a historian or a journalist or anyone telling a story was forced to choose out of an infinite number of facts what to present and what to omit. And that decision inevitably would reflect, whether consciously or not, the interests of the historian." I feel when listening to people about the topic of Israel and Palestine, you can immediately glean the perspective of the presenter or person from just how one person will present the topic versus a different presenter, often just by like little simple things like a slightly different selection of words, like how more pro-Palestinian people will say October War versus more pro-Israeli people will call it the Yom Kippur War. Knowing that everyone has a bias, I want to state my own biases up front. I'm a Palestinian American, and I have very pro-Palestinian views. I'm also part of the queer community, so that does play some role in how I view my own culture. In this video, we are going to look at one such presenter of information, that being Prageru. Chapter 1. What the fuck is Prageru? Am I pretentious yet, being that I call these chapters now? Prageru is a YouTube channel posing as a university funded by oil billionaires to further neoliberalism. And you know what's funny, which is something that no other YouTube channel has brought up yet? You can take quizzes on their website just to see if you can regurgitate conservative talking points while feeling like you took a test. Oh look, I got 100% on this test. Hey Dennis, send me my diploma now. The point of these videos, though, are just to gish-gallop you with so many talking points that it is even hard to respond to, being that a response to something typically takes around a magnitude more time to respond to. Originally, when I was planning this video, I was gonna just respond to one claim after another, and also bring up some stuff in Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, to explain some of those big omissions. Alan Dershowitz is a presenter on a few of those Prageru videos. Anyway, I have decided to present something a little different. Chapter 2, Avi Shlaim and the New Historians. Avi Shlaim is an Israeli historian, part of a movement of Israeli historians attacking the fundamental creation myths of Israel. Some of these new historians include Benny Morris, Baruch Kimmerling, Ilan Pape, Tom Segev, as well as many others. Avi Shlaim described the new historians' differences from what he termed the official history in the following terms. The official version said that Britain tried to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. The new historians claimed that the British tried to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. The official version said that the Palestinians fled their homes of their own free will. The new historians said that the refugees were chased out or expelled. The official version said that the balance of power was in favor of the Arabs. The new historians said that Israel had the advantage both in manpower and in arms. The official version said that the Arabs had a coordinated plan to destroy Israel. The new historian said that the Arabs were divided. The official version said that Arab intransigence prevented peace. The new historian said that Israel is primarily to blame for the dead end. Pape suggests that the Zionist leaders intended to displace most Palestinian Arabs. Morris believes that the displacement happened in the heat of war. According to the new historians, Israel and the Arab countries each have their share of responsibility for the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian plight. When I watch Prageru videos, I think they are presenting the old history, or mythography if I may be allowed to be poetic. So in this video, I'm going to be using primarily a few books and writing my own version of history. And that is going to be my presentation out of an infinite number of facts, of which that I am presenting and omitting. Also, I'm going to show how Prageru distorts history with some of their own omissions. Disclaimer section. So, one problem when discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that anti-Zionism and anti-Israel sentiments can be a guise for white nationalism and anti-Semitism. A good example of this with just talking about language is, and this is an older racist term, but It's the term ZOG, which stands for Zionist Occupied Government. This term just means that the American government is secretly controlled by a cabal of Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is concerning to me, and I think any of us who criticize the state of Israel have the duty to be very careful with our words, because it is very easy to turn anti-Israel stuff into stuff that feeds into anti-Semitism more broadly. For example, one of the books I use for a few sources is this book called The Israel Lobby by John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen M. Rault. I don't think that this book is anti-Semitic, but it definitely is pretty easy for an anti-Semite to legitimize his views about the Zog with just the book title, despite the authors making their statements pretty clear on the subject, and acknowledging that the fact is pretty easy to misinterpret at face value. Abigail from PhilosophyTube has a great video on the subject of anti-Semitism that should just be considered a primer for this video. Shoo, go away. I'll still be here. I am forever in this YouTube box window and will not die. Keep in mind that here in the US, as of 2019, most anti-religious hate crimes, 60.3%, happen towards Jewish people. And it isn't really that hard to find anti-Semitic shit in the Middle East. Here's a Egyptian scholar defending the protocols.
الحركة الصهيونية العنصرية دي حركة بتتحضر من زمان، خطة بتتحضر من زمان وكمان من قبل الميلاد. غزو صهيوني سلمي لكل دول العالم.
Also, we can't forget that, Hamas fucking spreads this shit in their own covenant. Article 32 of their covenant explicitly names the protocols as the reason why Zionists do what they do. I'd like people to also check out the Vice video in the footnotes as well. It is really good, and I just recommend it as a primer to the topic of Jewish conspiracy theories. And because of this, I'd personally argue many Jewish people are rightfully a little scared that things can just take a turn for the worse. And anti-Semitism also emboldens right-wing Israelis into being war hawks. So if you believe in things like the protocols of the Lord and Elders of Zion, or Jews-controlled media, or any Jewish conspiracy theory, just please go away. Your efforts are hurting the Palestinians, as if using our conflict as a guise to be racist helps the Palestinians get any further. Anti-Semites can go die in a hole. Oh boy, if I had 1,000 subscribers, this would get demonetized way fast. Hey, our little pizza dough is done. Look at that. And if you take this and you look at a light, it has light come through it. Anyway, let's get to the next section. Disclaimer section 2. So, okay, now I've talked about the need to be careful when criticizing the Israelis, because it can lean into anti-Semitism really easily, and sometimes without the author or orator's original intent. With all that said, we also need to address the elephant in the room, which is anti-Arab racism from the other side. Now, I should note that technically speaking, anti-Arab racism is actually just anti-Semitism, because Arabs also speak a Semitic language, but because of modern usages, only Semites who come from Jewish backgrounds get the label Semitic as opposed to Arabs. I don't know what to do with that information, but changing topics to anti-Semitism, I think Holocaust denial is just anti-Semitism, because you're denying the plight of the Jewish people during World War II. With all that said, why isn't Nakba denialism, Nakba being the word that the Palestinians use to describe their ethnic cleansing, not also anti-Arab racism? I would argue it is, based on that previous Holocaust example. I could cite till the cows come home areas where Arabs are being anti-Semitic, but why don't you just read Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, for more of this? He does cite some very real cases of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. With that said, here's some fun mix of anti-Arab racism from the other side. In 1969, then Israeli Prime Minister told London Sunday Times, "There is no such thing as a Palestinian people. It is not as if we came and threw them out and took their country. They didn't exist." Which, that is quite something of a statement. Historian Ilan Pape described Meir in April of 1948 visiting Haifa. She at first found it hard to suppress a feeling of horror when she entered homes where cooked food still stood on tables. Children had left toys, and books on the floor, and life appeared to have frozen in an instant. Maya had come from Palestine, from the US, where her family had fled in the wake of pogroms in Russia, and the sights she witnessed that day reminded her of the worst stories her family had told her about the Russian brutality against Jews decades earlier. I don't know what to say, but oof. It sounds like someone is purposely forgetting her own history here. Of course, we can also bring up the racism of Benny Morris, the only one of the new historians that Dershowitz likes using. Morris has called the Israeli Arabs a time bomb, which, for this Benedict Arnold and this Prageru video, guess what a lot of Israelis think? That you're just going to turn on the state. Also, Morris thinks that the ethnic cleansing was justified. Also, he compares Palestinian society as being a serial killer that must be imprisoned. Just to hammer this point home a little more, here are some worrying statistics to me as an Arab. Over half of the Jewish population in Israel believes the marriage of a Jewish woman to an Arab man is equal to national treason, according to a recent survey by the Geocartography Institute. The survey, which was conducted for the Center Against Racism, also found that over 75% of the participants did not approve of apartment buildings being shared between Arabs and Jews. 60% of the participants said that they would not allow an Arab to visit their home. For some context, these were taken around 2006, so in my own lifetime. Of course, it isn't hard to bring up that the ultra-Orthodox Jewish rabbis pushing for more settlements will put racism against Arabs in their sermons to justify their colonization of the West Bank. And just so you know, American Jews and Christians also have their own anti-Arab racism. Here is Ben Shapiro with his hot takes.
Israelis like to build. Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. Ew. This is not a difficult issue. Hashtag settlements rock.
Do we really need analysis for this racist garbage? He was fucking 27 when he made this comment. He can't say he was too young, like when he defended a mass murderer like Ariel Sharon. I mean, of course we have more Nakba denialism from former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee, stating that there's really no such thing as a Palestinian. That was a person who was running for the highest office in the land. I think this has been enough evidence to show that I'm not just making this up, and let's move on to the next part of the video. I should note that I'm not really that much of a historian, more of a compiler of history written by other far more talented people than myself. I use their work because, say, reading things from Ben-Gurion's diary is not very accessible to me as far as I know. And so I've had to use other people's work who can read those documents and then use quotations from them. So that any error is from them, and I'm mostly just signal boosting their work primarily. This has been made so much better because of the many authors I cite, and I'm forever grateful to them. Also, it should be noted that Israel is the only government in the Middle East to actually release archives, and that is a credit to Israel. This is not to say that they are perfect by any means, God no. With any release of documents by a government, tons of censorship is going to inevitably take place that is going to make its state look better. Take this quote from Benny Morris, for instance. The speeches, debates, diaries, and memoranda that the Zionist bureaucrats issued wholesale passed through the sieve of political censorship on the way to publication. A large portion disappeared or were distorted. Historians and students using those sources would do well to employ a large measure of caution. This is why I rely more on, say, Ilan Pappé's writings as opposed to Benny Morris. Benny Morris uses almost exclusively Israeli state archive material, which isn't bad, but ignoring oral history will make any person interested in this conflict miss a lot of stuff. I still use Morris occasionally because he is not a bad source by any means, but I personally feel his history feels less complete because of the one-sided nature to his approach. Chapter 3. Who did the British support in Palestine? The Arabs or the Jewish settlers? Section 3.1. We're going to start this section off a little weird, but go before the conflict really started coming to fruition in 1896 with Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat. In English, that means the Jewish state. The pamphlet urged that if Jewish people are to be protected from anti-Semitism, which is why Zionism was needed, that the Jews would need a state to protect their rights fully, so Jews would not suffer pogroms or other forms of anti-Semitism. It is a noble goal. Eventually, the Zionist Congress found it would be Palestine for the choice. Previous debates concerned Palestine, Argentina, Uganda, and Madagascar. Keep in mind, this is how Herzl saw how to obtain the land for a Jewish state. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. With the founding of Zionism, upper-class Palestinians came to notice this idea, and some would become worried. One such figure was Yusuf Dia. Yusuf Dia would send a letter to French Chief Rabbi Zadok Khan on March 1, 1899. This letter has parts of it deliberately quoted by some as to show that Dia was in favor of Zionist colonization, like how he viewed Zionism as natural, beautiful, and just, and who could contest the rights of the Jews in Palestine? My God, historically it is your country. Dia was worried because he feared displacement in the wake of the Zionist program for Palestine, writing such things as the brutal force of circumstances had to be taken into account, and that Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it is inhabited by others. Dia would eventually conclude in his letter that, in the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. Herzl would reply swiftly on March 19, 1899, employing a justification that would later be used by many colonialists, that the Jews would benefit the indigenous population with their financial acumen and intelligence, not really responding to the claims of Palestine's Arabs, which is, what is going to happen to us if you make this a Jewish majority country? Knowing also what Herzl privately believed, it looks to be that Dia's worries were valid concerns. Around this time, we also had the creation of such things like the Jewish National Funds, or JNF for short. This agency was a key tool of colonialism up until 1948. The JNF was set up in 1901 with the express goal of buying lands from absentee landlords who were likely to live at some distance from those areas and would evict the Arabs living on that land for new Jewish settlements. I wonder why the Arabs might want a restriction on Jewish immigration to Palestine later. The head of the JNF settlement department, Yosef Weitz, would make it his job to convince the new Jewish landowners to evict the tenants, which was unprecedented in history, and would describe the Jewish landowners, when they would allow the Arabs to stay in a plot of land cultivating the land, as cowardly. Let's fast forward to World War I. A very momentous statement would be made by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Arthur Balfour, on behalf of Britain's cabinet on November 2, 1917. This is what was known to become the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Prior to World War I, the Arabs were already worrying about displacement, but effectively with this one declaration, the Zionist ambitions of Theodor Herzl would begin to get backed by the British government. Also, if you notice a subtle thing like how the Jews are promised sovereignty, whereas the rest of Palestine's community is just said to be the non-Jewish communities, which is more than 90% of the population in 1918. And only promising that nothing should be done against their civil and religious rights. This is just one of two times that the Arabs were led to a raw deal by the British. The first time was the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, which promised Sharif Hussein of Mecca the rights towards Arabia and the Levant in exchange for revolting against the Ottomans in World War I. This would be undermined by the British and French with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916.
Hey, what's the Sykes-Picot Agreement?
Glad you asked, Voice from the Void. Here's an instructional video on what it is. Why, hello there! I really love maps, don't you know? And sometimes I look at maps and I see that there are straight lines on them, like, all over the place. Like, you do all know that, straight lines aren't really that straight on globes, right? I want to show you all this particular straight line. This is the borders of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. If we also look at a population map, you find that these borders don't really correspond to the people at all. This is because the British and French divide the Middle East this way through what is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The line was dividing the French and British interests. Also, it's called that because the diplomats' names were Sykes and Picot, so that's why the name is there. Many people in the Middle East found this to be a backstabbing by the British because of the Hussein McMahon correspondence. The Arabs were promised independence and self-rule through the Sharif of Mecca, but this secret agreement by the British and French has damaged a lot of Arab trust in the British. Keep this in mind, this is still something brought up by Islamic militants today.
الآن ولله الحمد والمنة نحن الآن على الحدود ما بين أرض الشام وأرض الرافدين ولله والمنة هذه أرض الشام أمامكم ولله الحمد وهذا التركس أتينا به لفتح السواتر وفتح الطريق أمام المسلمين ولله الحمد والمنة ها طبقنا وما نبتغيه وهو الكفر باتفاقية سايس بيكو.
Yes, that is modern day ISIS bringing up this agreement. This is going to be a long trend, but we've kind of lost a lot of trust with the region, and it's going to take a lot of work moving forward in helping stabilize the region. Going back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, how did the Arabs of Palestine take the news of this? Well, because of the ban on publishing the Balfour Declaration in Palestine, the word of this coming into Palestine was slow to come in. But by December of 1918, from newspapers in Syria, 33 Palestinians, including the writer of the Palestinian newspaper, Filastin, Isa al-Isa, learned about this and were very angered by this and would begin sending letters of protest to the Versailles Peace Conference and stressing this country is our country, and were in shock about the Zionist claim that Palestine would be turned into a national home for them. The British support at this point was due to a very concerted effort by the Zionist Congress, particularly the successor to Theodore Herzl and later to be Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, with the lobbying of the British government, who at the time had many followers who were influenced by premillennialism, a type of theology that is reminiscent of many American Christians, where the Christians think for the second coming of Christ to happen, they need the Jewish people to return to Palestine. In 1922, Weizmann would ultimately get a promise from Balfour at a dinner at his house in the company of Balfour, Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill that they would guarantee him a Jewish state, and for that reason would never allow representative government in Palestine. During 1922, the mandate for Palestine was formalized in the League of Nations. This League of Nations mandate on Palestine included in its text that key declaration by Balfour previously mentioned, and also started to give the Jews of Palestine quasi-political rights enshrined in Article 4 of the League of Nations mandate on Palestine. In this same mandate, Jews are described as the only people with connection to the land, which I don't know, but if you've never met a Palestinian Tata, well, let me tell you, they will wax on about the magical properties of olives and olive oil, and I will never stop taking shots of olive oil because of her. And if that ain't a connection to Palestine, I don't know what the fuck is.
I've never seen you do that in your life.
Of course I take my shot of olive oil. I would never lie to my Palestinian Tata. Article 7 of the Mandate on Palestine also created a nationality law that helped facilitate getting Jewish settlers citizenship, while Palestinian Arabs abroad coming to return would be denied that citizenship. As part of this, the British held out qualified Arab officials from holding higher office, censored newspapers, banned political activity when it discomforted the British to the 1920s, whilst Jewish leaders, because of Article 4, were already able to establish diplomatic status and could thereby formally represent Zionist interests before the League of Nations and elsewhere. The sponsorship of the British towards the Zionist program via the League of Nations would eventually lead to 3 Arab riots and 2 massacres of Jews at Safed and Hebron. The 3 riots were in 1920, 1921, and 1929. These 3 riots were spontaneous and because of growing discontent from the Arabs' growing losses of their political ability to stop encroachment of Zionist aims in Palestine. The 2 massacres also cannot be avoided being tied to this, but being that anti-Semitism is a thing in the Middle East, you listeners should be aware that this is a thing influencing these 2 massacres. It should also be noted that hundreds of Jewish people were also saved by the Arab neighbors, hiding them in their houses away from the rioters. I don't know. I just feel like I should give some context to these events. These events would lead the conflict into a more militant angles for all sides coming to this. The British government, in the fallout of these riots, and massacres would try to limit Jewish immigration to appease the Arabs of Palestine. But this proved not to do so much because of the Zionist lobby in England successfully stopping this limit, and most likely made the Arab revolt of 1936 to 39 inevitable. We should pull back and talk about some new characters coming to the scene. The new characters are going to be the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the Jewish paramilitary groups, and the various Arab political leaders working in Palestine in other capacities. Section 3.2. Let's start by talking about the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. A little note to people, his first name isn't actually Hajj, it's Muhammad. He went on pilgrimage to Mecca, and people that do that are called Hajj very often. Anyway, that's just a tangent about names. He was the second Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and that's because his position was only created in 1918. Traditionally, there were 4 muftis in just Jerusalem for each of the Sunni sects of Islam, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and Hanafi, respectively. This position was one of many created by the British to actually divide the Palestinian representational power amongst many different factions, often family members themselves, but this position itself was appointed by Sir Herbert Samuel in 1921, despite being the least popular of the 4 possible candidates for this position, in that he was going to try to keep order in Palestine during his stay of power. Another one of these positions used to help destabilize Palestinian political leadership was the creation of the Arab Executive of the Palestinian Congresses, which was headed by the Mufti's cousin, Musa Kazem Pasha al-Husseini. This organization was created by the British to essentially divide power between these 2 Husseinis, and also to give the Palestinians the illusion of organizing power, but it held very low power and also didn't represent the public in the way maybe a nationwide democratic representative institution would do. There is one more Palestinian institution of note, but they come up in 1936 during the Arab Revolt of 36-39, so we'll return to them soon enough. Let's move on to the various Jewish paramilitary groups. Section 3.3. The first group to talk about is the Haganah. Haganah means defense in Hebrew, and this first group was first formed to protect the Yeshuv. The Yeshuv are just the early Jewish enclaves in Palestine. They were founded around 1920 in response to protecting the Jewish settlements from Arabs of Palestine retaliating, like in the cases of 1920 to 21 and 1929. The Haganah was generally less extreme than the next 2 groups I will be talking about in just a bit, favoring self-restraint. However, this would change around 1945 when the British would hold back Jewish immigration to Palestine, which would incite some of the Haganah to being driven to do terrorism. The Haganah also had more elite troops called the Palmach, who will also be talked about later. Some of the notable leaders are people like Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, and Zev Jabotinsky. One of these people, Rabin, was to be a later Israeli prime minister, and Dayan would be a later defense minister. The second group in our cavalcade of characters is the group called Irgun, or Itzel. This group split from the Haganah in 1931, advocating much harsher policies like terrorism. Such famous acts of terrorism were stuff like the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. This group was headed by people like Zev Jabotinsky, Menachem Begin, and Yitzhak Shamir. The latter 2 names later became prime ministers of Israel under the Likud party. It is worth to note some stuff about Zev Jabotinsky and his pretty far-right views, that his politics influenced many Israeli politicians like the last 2 prime ministers I mentioned, but also, say, people like Ariel Sharon and former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose father worked as Jabotinsky's personal secretary. I've been trying this whole video to not try to put up a bunch of quotes to make it seem like I'm padding this out, plus this essay would be much longer, but check out this quote from Jabotinsky's essay, The Iron Wall. There can be no voluntary agreement between ourselves and the Palestine Arabs, not now nor in the prospective future. I say this with such conviction, not because I want to hurt the moderate Zionists. I do not believe that they will be hurt, except for those who were born blind. They realized long ago that it is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestine Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. My readers may have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried out on the consent of the native population. there is no consent. The native population, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists, irrespective whether they were civilized or savage. And it made no difference whether the colonists behaved decently or not. The companions of Cortez and Pizarro, or as some people will remind us, our own ancestors under Joshua ben Nun, behaved like brigands. But the Pilgrim Fathers, the first real pioneers of North America, were people of the highest morality who did not want to do harm to anyone, least of all the Red Indians. And they honestly believed that there was enough room in the prairies both for the paleface and the redhead. Yet the native population fought with the same ferocity against the good colonists as against the bad. Every native population, civilized or not, regards its land as its national home, of which it's the sole master, and it wants to retain that mastery and will refuse to admit not only new masters, but even new partners or collaborators. I do find it very interesting that people like Alan Dershowitz are intent on not calling the early Zionists not colonialists, when an early Zionist is like, nah bro, we are colonialists, we just see it as moral, such as David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, who said in 1938 to the Jewish agency executive, I am for compulsory transfer, I do not see anything immoral in it. Even say to be comparing the natives in North America to the Palestinians is pretty telling, because Jabotinsky didn't seem to view the mass-scale genocide as wrong, and also, funny thing, or maybe not so funny, Dershowitz does the same thing in his own book. But yeah, when you're comparing your own movement to a country for which it has a still horrible track record with dealing with its native population, I think you may want to reevaluate your opinions a little. This is getting to be a little too tangential, and we should just move on to the Stern Gang, otherwise known as the Lehi. The Stern Gang, also known as the Lehi, is the last Jewish paramilitary group. This paramilitary group was a very openly anti-British section of the Irgun who were to split once again into their own group. Also, they courted Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in an attempt to help rid the British from Palestine and to get Jews to be transferred to Palestine and essentially out of the camps. They would be the group that would end up doing some of the famous assassinations, like on Count Folke Bernadotte, and being one of the two groups who committed the Deir Yassin massacre. Some of its more famous leaders are Yitzhak Shamir, Nathan Yalin Moore, and Abraham Stern. Okay, with the main actors out, let's talk about more British support of the Zionist forces in Palestine. From the beginning of the Mandate, the British were very supportive to the Jewish enclaves, and many members of the British military would help train the Haganah. For example, Ord Wingate would teach the Haganah proper military techniques. During the Arab Revolt, Wingate successfully got the Haganah to jointly attack a Palestinian village in 1938. Amatzia Cohen remembered during this operation that the British sergeant showed them how to use bayonets in attacking defenseless villagers. I think you are totally ignorant in your Ramat Yochanan, the trading base for the Haganah, since you do not know even the elementary use of bayonets when attacking dirty Arabs. How can you put your left foot in front? I want to add an outsider point of view here as well. This is an NYT journalist who, when spending time with these settlers, was appalled about the flagrant racism, which, if you're writing in 1929, you've got to be really above and beyond.
You still haven't talked about the Arab Revolt of 36 to 39 yet. You just brought it up there.
Okay, fine. We will get to talking about the revolt to conclude this history section. During the 1930s, the Jewish economy overtook the Arab sector in the economy for the first time, and the Jewish population growing to over 30% by 1939, and with an expansion of the Zionist military capabilities, the goal of Zionism was more quickly being realized in Palestine. And with the heavy influx of Jewish immigrants during this time, the Jewish state would be soon realized. As David Ben-Gurion put it at the time, immigration at the rate of 60,000 a year means a Jewish state in all of Palestine. Palestinians were often seeing themselves becoming strangers in their own land, and with also the advent of Zionist land purchases, which would usually be accompanied by the expulsion of the Arabs who would live on this land, this would lead to demonstrations against the British much more commonly happening. And in an attempt to maintain the order, the elite notables would organize a pan-Islamic conference, while sending several delegations to London coordinated various forms of protest, but these leaders were also comparably timid compared to the Palestinian public, whom wanted to do a full-on boycott of the British authorities and a tax strike, which would ultimately lead to a failing of convincing the British government from steering away from the Zionist cause. The response still was somewhat heard by Britain throughout the years and would lead to a variety of commissions and inquiries and white papers. These include the Haywood Commission in 1920, the Churchill White Paper in 1922, the Shaw Commission in 1929, the Hope-Simpson Report in 1930, the Passfield White Paper in 1930, the Peel Commission in 1937, and the Woodhead Commission in 1938. The problem with a lot of these policy papers is they only gave limited measures to placate the Palestinians, or in some ways would further kick Palestinians off their land, such as in the Peel Commission in 1937, which would create a small Jewish state in 17% of the country. But it would also require that 200,000 Arabs would be expelled. In the paper, it should be noted that this is euphemized as transfer. And when you see things like this from Prageru,
after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, Britain took control of most of the Middle East, including the area that constitutes modern Israel. 17 years later, in 1936, the Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors. The British formed a task force, the Peel Commission, to study the cause of the rebellion. The commission concluded that the reason for the violence was that two peoples, Jews and Arabs, wanted to govern the same land. The answer, the Peel Commission concluded, would be to create two independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, a two-state solution. The suggested split was heavily in favor of the Arabs. The British offered them 80% of the disputed territory, the Jews the remaining 20%. Yet, despite the tiny size of their proposed state, the Jews voted to accept this offer. But the Arabs rejected it and resumed their violent rebellion. Rejection number one.
you might begin to understand why the Palestinian Arabs would reject the Peel Commission. It's never as cut and dry as the Arabs just rejected the plan while the Zionists just accepted it, which is also misleading, but we will turn to that shortly.
Where they know you can't find them, as far from town as you want.
In 1936, the frustration over the ineffective Palestinian leadership over the last 15 years would culminate in a mass Palestinian grassroots strike that would last 6 months by many groups of Palestinian youths and also urban middle-class militants, many part of the Istiqlal Party. Istiqlal meaning independence in Arabic. Anyway, now this would end up with other Arab rulers around the Middle East getting the British to broker a deal with the Palestinians. This deal is the Peel Commission of July of 1937. This, as you know, would require 200,000 Arabs to be removed from the area, and the remainder of the land would be turned over to Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, which amounted to the Palestinians much of the same thing, so the Palestinians rejected this proposal. But did the Zionists actually accept the Peel Commission? The answer is actually mixed. On paper, yes, they did, but that required a lot of convincing by Ben Gurion. Were the Zionists content with another Arab or Palestinian state next to them in other parts of the land of Palestine? Well, here's Ben Gurion talking to the Zionist executive in 1937. After the formation of a large army in the wake of the establishment of a state, we will abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. He also told his son Amos in the same year, erect a Jewish state at once, even if not in the whole land. The rest will come in the course of time. It must come. This isn't showing to be peaceful, and in the failure of the Peel Commission, this sparked massive waves of violence in Palestine. The armed revolt that finally sparked in October of 1937 would give the British opportunity to put down this Palestinian insurrection with a great display of force, and deployed 100,000 troops, or for sake of context, 1 soldier for every 4 Palestinian adult males. The suppression might have been the best gift to the Zionists as well, for this would leave 10% of the Arab population of Palestine killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. The tactics employed by the British to put down the insurrection, needless to say, could be called cruel. From summary executions, for example, Sheikh Farhan Sati, an 81-year-old rebel leader who was put to death by the British for possession of a single bullet. These executions were to happen over 100 times, but not limited to just things like these. The British would resort to tying Palestinian prisoners to fronts of armored cars and locomotives to prevent Arab rebel attacks. Just for the curious out there, this is not the first time the British did this to anyone. They also did this to the Irish in its War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. The British forces would also use the destruction of homes of already executed or imprisoned rebel leaders and the detention of thousands without trial or exile. This would culminate in the assassination of the British Direct Commissioner of the Galilee, Captain Lewis Andrews, in October of 1937, and in response, the British were to exile the entire Palestinian nationalist leadership. Despite these mass arrests of Arab political leaders, the uprising would go into an even more intense phase, and the British would lose control of many areas of Palestine. Lieutenant General Robert Haining, for some context, this is the officer in command of the British forces in Palestine, remarking in August of 1938, the situation was such that civil administration of the country was, to all practical purposes, non-existent. By December, Haining would remark that practically every village in the country harbors and supports the rebels and will assist in concealing their identity from the government forces. While this was going on, the Palestinians were becoming split between pro- and anti-Peel Commission proposals of partition. Some would begin to align with Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, but still most Palestinians would reject this. But there was still enough of a split for a mini civil war around this because of how concessionary the opposition would be to the British. The Mufti of Jerusalem supported a full-on no-compromise position, while the former Jerusalem mayor, Raghib al-Nashashibi, favored being more conciliatory. Inter-Palestinian disputes would lead to hundreds of assassinations, which, in the view of Isa al-Isa, sapped the strength of the Palestinians, who he himself would be forced into exile in Beirut when his house was burned down, most likely by the Mufti's men in Palestine. With this revolt, that would eventually settle in the summer of 1939. It would weaken and further split the Palestinians, while the Zionist forces were actually being trained by the British at this time, and would give some slight gains to the Palestinians at this point to appease the Arabs, because guess what? War clouds are looming, World War II is around the corner, and this would cause the Neville Chamberlain government in Britain to give out the 1939 White Paper to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine. In the worst time to kind of do it because, the Holocaust was going on, this document would also limit Jewish land purchases in Palestine. Another big demand of the Arabs also would promise representative institutions in 5 years and self-determination in 10 years. These latter three things promised would not be upheld by the British. This would lead to the backlash of the Jewish communities in Palestine and essentially would start a spurt of British terrorism by groups like the Irgun and the Stern Gang. Now, knowing all of this, with basically just the exception of the White Paper, the British have been severely helping the Zionists out through various means, and I think this myth isn't really necessary when talking about Prageru's general points, but it is a needed start to understand the conflict. I've been sourcing my material this whole time, but if you like the history, I highly recommend the introduction in Chapter 1 of The 100 Years' War on Palestine. That book gave me a lot of good insights into writing this chapter, and for that, I just want to signal boost it a bit. We now need to move on to the next section so we can actually talk about why Israel came to be the state it is today. Also, I need to finish that pizza. I want to start off this section with a little talk about the alphabet. A little thing about the word alphabet in English. It is actually just the letters alpha and beta combined to basically make a portmanteau of saying the ABCs in Greek. Even if you disagree with my video, you can now leave knowing a fun fact. I mean, not all the other fun facts, like Palestine did get ethnically cleansed in 1948. I guess that's not really a fun fact, but you get my bit. Anyway, we are now talking about the Hebrew alphabet and the first four letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and Dalet. These letters are symbols for some pretty famous plans that led to the dislocation of the Palestinians, and let's talk about that. Section 4.1, Hebraising Palestine and the Village Files. Before we get into the plans, I think it might be good to talk about the cultural side of the Palestinian country. We talked earlier in this video about the Jewish National Fund, or JNF for short, and how it would purchase land from absentee landlords who lived away from the land and then would evict the Arabs of that land from it. Now, I guess you might be some apologist for colonialism who doesn't understand why that is a problem, but we live further and further away from a feudal society, so a lot of people miss the point today that it was historically a dick move to kick people off the land because they viewed new landowners as just a new person to pay taxes to, e.g. buying land in a feudal society also buys the people that live there as serfs. This strategy of making Jewish Palestine is actually pretty ineffective. Even just thinking about it a little, by the end of the mandate in 1948, the Jewish community still only owned 5.8% of the entire land. So more strategies were needed by the Jewish settlers to Hebraize Palestine. And based on the next events, I think there is some intent. If not, this fell into a place of being a really happy accident for the Jewish communities in Palestine. Here comes the Village Files. Joseph Feitz, when hearing of the development, would turn this into a national project. Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, in a letter to Moshe Sharet, Ben-Zvi being a later president of Israel and Sharet being a later prime minister, that apart from just topographically recording the layout of the villages, they should also try to find the Hebraic origins to the Palestinian villages. Though this last part is maybe more of a personal concern to Ben-Zvi himself, being that he published a book with Ben Gurion in Yiddish called Gate to the Jewish Settlement, where he argued that the Falahin, peasant farmers, were actually descendants of Jewish peasants who had stayed in Palestine after the Roman exile in 70 CE. The end result of a lot of this intelligence gathering was that by the late 1930s, the Village Files had built up very detailed files on each of the Palestinian villages. Precise details of the topography, access to roads, water springs, quality of land, main sources of income, the socio-political composition, religious affiliation, the name of its mukhtars, the leaders/heads of villages, and many, many more things. But one very interesting thing was that they also gave a hostility index based on the village's participation in the 1936 revolt. Part of this was also a list of people or families who participated in the revolt and a list of people who had allegedly killed Jews. Some members of the Haganah would come to learn that this wasn't just merely an exercise of geography as well. Moshe Pasternak, who joined one of the early data collection operations in 1940, recalled, "We had to study the basic structure of the Arab village. This means the structure and how best to attack it. In the military schools, I had been taught how to attack a modern European city, not a primitive village in the Near East. We cannot compare it, an Arab village, to a Polish or an Austrian one. The Arab village, unlike the European one, was topographically on hills. That meant we had to find how best to approach the village, from above or enter it from below. We had to train our Arabists, the Orientalists who operated a network of collaborators, how best to work with informants." Now, there would be a few updates to this over the years, but the final update has something really important that needs to be brought up in 1947. They would add a wanted persons list in each village. Once the villages were occupied, the men would be lined up and an informant wearing a cloth sack with eye holes cut out would choose those appearing on the list, and those who got picked out would often be shot on the spot. The criteria for inclusion on this list would be involvement in the Palestinian national movement, having close ties to the leader of the movement, the Mufti Haji Amin al-Husseini. Other reasons, though, to be included on this list were incidental things like known to have traveled in Lebanon or arrested by the British authorities for being members of a national committee in a village. Now, it should be noted that the Mufti's party dominated Palestinian political organizing since the start of the mandate, and as a result, his party was widespread and had many members in the AHC. So this constitutes a crime now to the creators of the Village Files, and could put them on a list to be expelled or killed. Yigal Yadin recalled that it was the minute and detailed knowledge that was going on about every single village that the Zionist military command in 1947 concluded that the Palestine Arabs had nobody to organize them properly. The biggest issue for the Zionists would be the British, and this would have them wait for their, to put it in Ben Gurion's words, opportune moment. Section 4.2, build up to the 1948 war and the departure of the British from Palestine. God, I'm just very sorry about this because it feels like I keep going back to add facts in later sections, but I just like writing history in this way where it is tiny or mini histories from various perspectives because, I mean, I could write a history like how Randy Schultz wrote and the band played on, where it's just a timeline of the events as the AIDS crisis unfolded, but that history is kind of confusing to me personally, and don't get me wrong, I love that book, but it can be quite confusing if you want to trace one person or one group. Up until 1942, the Jewish forces in Palestine would be prepared to defend the Jewish enclaves from the Nazis. But after 1942, this fear would abate with the ending of the battles of Al Alamein. Coming close to the end of World War II, with the tides changing in the world order, the Irgun realized that the time to break the British hold of Palestine was at hand. At this point, being that the British had already broken most of the political organizing of the Palestinians during the Arab Revolt by either exiling them out of the countries to places like the Seychelles, killing them, or imprisoning their fighting forces, the Irgun sought out terrorism as the method to get the British to leave Palestine. If you're curious, I'm going to link a list of terrorist acts perpetrated by the Irgun in my sources, so if you want to check that out, check the footnotes Google Doc. It is also really funny to me because you'll see these clips from like Prageru.
Between 1948 and 1967, despite the armistice, Arab terrorists continue to infiltrate Israeli borders and to injure and kill Israeli citizens. That was part of an official policy by the surrounding governments and by leaders of local Palestinian groups. All of it was in violation, obvious violation of international law. Following the establishment of Israel, a transfer of populations occurred. Several 100,000 Arabs who fled from Israel during the War of Independence were not allowed to return. Some had chosen to leave, assured by their Arab leaders that the fledgling country would not last a week. Others were forced to leave.
These things are forgetting the fact that these terror acts by the Irgun towards the British and the Arabs were part of why Israel was able to be founded in 1948. But now as a result, people will blame the Palestinians when they use terrorism, even though it was a viable means for some of the founders of Israel to use. This is interesting, to do things that were illegal at the time, and here's a picture of later Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, on a terrorism wanted poster. I think this is like the international version of do as I say, not as I do in regards to politics. And keep in mind, what is the definition of terrorism are unbearably murky as well. Like, take for instance this passage from Pape's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine during a campaign in Haifa. From the morning after the UN partition resolution was adopted, the 75,000 Palestinians in the city were subjected to a campaign of terror by the Irgun and the Haganah. As they had only arrived in recent decades, the Jewish settlers had built their houses higher up on the mountains, thus they had lived topographically above the Arab neighborhoods and could easily shell and snipe at them. They had started doing this frequently since early December. They used other methods of intimidation as well. The Jewish troops rolled barrels full of explosives and huge steel balls into the Arab residential areas and poured oil mixed with fuel down the road, which they then ignited. The moment panic-stricken Palestinian residents came running out of their homes to try to extinguish these rivers of fire, they were sprayed by machine gun fire. I just want to note that that December date is in reference to 1947, before the state of Israel was even founded. Not during the Arab-Israeli War of 48, which may become important later. But anyway, is that terrorism? I would argue yes. But apparently doing this kind of stuff to intimidate the civilian population isn't really important to mention for someone like Dershowitz in his condemnations of terrorism. But that isn't even the point. Terrorism is a bit of a red herring. If you think about it, the issue is that the Israeli government engages in an ethnic cleansing, and that continued oppression is happening to this very day. Oh gosh, I'm jumping way ahead here. Let's get back to the topic of this. Keep in mind the difference between how the British responded to the Arab revolt of 36 to 39 compared to the Irgun's terrorism. The British destroyed the leaders of the political organizations and exiled many of them. For example, the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini never returned to Palestine, and might I add personally, good riddance to that guy. But still, the British were being very different in terms of how they put down the various revolts by these groups. Let's now talk about Ben Gurion and what he was doing around this time. In August of 1946, Ben Gurion would gather the leaders of the Zionist movement in a hotel in Paris to discuss the issue of Palestine. To this point, many of the Zionists were in favor of the Biltmore program, which was just to take the whole of the Mandate of Palestine. But Ben Gurion proposed a different idea, an old, new idea, that they would demand partition of Palestine. There were arguments, but the decision came in the words of Ben Gurion: we will demand a large chunk of Palestine. The conference would not talk about the Arabs as a point of resistance, and the chief concern was the British to the Zionist movement. This is most probably because the British still held 100,000 troops and could theoretically put down a Jewish insurrection in Palestine. But think about it for a second. Do you want to be the people putting down violently a Jewish rebellion in Palestine after the Holocaust? The simple answer is no. The British, after all of this pressure from the Zionists, would quit Palestine during this time for quite a few reasons. One reason is that the looming Jewish rebellion is there as a possibility, and notice I say theoretically put down, because by this point things like the Palmach, the special forces of the Haganah, were very well trained and equipped at this time, and as the post-war Labour government made up its mind to leave India, they also lost a lot of reason to stay in Palestine, as the empire seems less and less useful to maintain. Also, Britain was just decimated economically after World War II, so the reasons to stay are thinning more and more. The British would announce that it would leave Palestine in 1947 and hand over the issue to the newly formed United Nations. The United Nations would propose United Nations Resolution 181. Ooh. Partition would be divided into three sections. 42% of the land would be the Arab state, where 818,000 Arabs would live at, and would include 10,000 Jews. The Jews would receive almost 56% of the land, where 499,000 Jews would live with 438,000 Arabs. And the third part was an international zone for Jerusalem. Now, the Arabs would reject this plan, and I kind of find this funny because had the Arabs accepted it, the Zionists would have undoubtedly rejected it because the Jews were not a majority in Eretz Israel at this point. So this would have left Israel to demand transfer as a condition on top of the partition, like in the Peel Commission. But it's interesting that all of this nuance is just mulled over on Prageru.
In 1947, the British asked the United Nations to find a new solution to the continuing tensions. Like the Peel Commission, the UN decided that the best way to resolve the conflict was to divide the land. In November 1947, the UN voted to create two states. Again, the Jews accepted the offer, and again, the Arabs rejected it. Only this time, they did so by launching an all-out war. Rejection number 2.
In Rashid Khaldi's book, The 100 Years' War in Palestine, he talks of an interesting story about his father sending a personal message on behalf of his uncle, who was also a former mayor of Jerusalem, to King Abdullah of Transjordan, that while the Palestinians appreciated his offer of protection, the actual word used was wasaya, which literally means tutelage or guardianship in Arabic, it would happen that the assembly vote on Palestine coincided also when Ismail Khalidi was telling King Abdullah that message. Angrily, he would get up and leave. Before leaving, the king would turn to Ismail to say, "You Palestinians have refused my offer. You deserve what happens to you." That is a really strange thing to say, but also this is where I have to point out that a very specific book has been written about this called Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine by Avi Shlaim, which I wanted to get for this project, but the first copy I found was out of print. And then I found one I could buy, and oh. So, if you want me to do bigger research videos in the future, you know, I do have a Patreon. Anyway, I will just use the description that Ilan Pape uses in his book about this event in Middle Eastern history. A little to bring up is when the Arabs were promised the land in the Levant area and Iraq originally by the British, Syria was promised to Faisal. But because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, he would be ousted from that position and be given Iraq instead. And this left Abdullah with just the country of Transjordan. Transjordan at the time was basically just an arid desert princedom east of the Jordan River and mostly filled with Bedouin and some Circassian villages. With this in mind, it should be no surprise that Abdullah wanted part of the Arab part of Palestine, which was more fertile and populated than Transjordan for himself. Around late 1946, many leading Zionists would embark on talks with Abdullah to essentially divide the Palestinian sections with Israel for both a greater Israel and a greater Jordan, where Jordan would specifically get many sections of Palestine and Israel would end up sacrificing notable Jewish holy spots in the process, such as Hebron or Khalil in Arabic. So when you see clips like this from Prageru,
Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria joined the conflict. But they failed. Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation. Most of the land set aside by the UN for an Arab state, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, became occupied territory. Occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan.
You are missing the context that this was under an agreement brought about by the Israelis so the 48 war could be made quite a bit easier. With this agreement, the Zionist forces in Palestine neutralized the only real threat to independence for the Jewish state, and thus we can finally move back into the UN partition plan again. Because of the Arab refusal of this plan, something that Ben-Gurion anticipated, Ben-Gurion would tell his inner circle at the consultancy that there are no territorial boundaries for the future Jewish state. With the British soon to leave Palestine and all of their biggest threats pacified, the Zionist leadership would now have no major barriers to their statehood. This would be the prelude of what was to come next. Section 4.3, Plan A, B, C, Aleph, Beit, Gimel. So plans A and B are essentially just Plan C put together in a revised format, so let's talk about Plan C, Gimel. Plan Gimel would be aimed at preparing the military forces of the Jewish community in Palestine for the offensive campaigns for when the British were gone. And by around the end of 1946, Ben-Gurion realized that the British were on the way out. Here is what Plan C entailed: killing the Palestinian political leadership, killing Palestinian insiders and their financial supporters, killing Palestinians who acted against Jews, killing senior Palestinian officers and officials in the mandatory system, damaging Palestinian transportation, damaging the sources of Palestinian livelihood, water wells, mills, etc., attacking nearby Palestinian villages likely to assist in future attacks, attacking Palestinian clubs, coffee houses, meeting places, etc. I'd like to add some commentary to this, but this speaks for itself, and this is before Plan Dalet in March of 1948, which would call for the systematic and total expulsion of the Arabs from Palestine. To talk about Plan Dalet is jumping ahead, so to get back on track, in response to the wholesale rejection of UN Resolution 181, the partition plan, and Ben-Gurion saying that there are no territorial boundaries, we are now entering the first phase of the Nakba. On November 2nd, 1947, which should just be noted that Resolution 181 would be adopted on November 29th of 1947, Ben-Gurion would spell out ethnic cleansing as a possible means. He would tell his audience that the Palestinians would make up a fifth column in Israel, and if so, they can be either mass arrested or expelled. It is better to expel them. This is just to be noted, but Ben-Gurion has a term he would use called the balance, referring to the demographic balance, and would be found a month later on December 3rd, 1947, giving a speech to senior members of his Mapai party. There are 40% non-Jews in the areas allocated to the Jewish state. This composition is not a solid basis for a Jewish state, and we have to face this new reality with all its severity and distinctness. Such a demographic balance questions our ability to maintain Jewish sovereignty. Only a state with at least 80% Jews is a viable, stable state. To also claim that this stuff from people like Ben-Gurion has no bearing on modern Israeli politics, look no further than the former Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. In December of 2003, Netanyahu recycled this stuff from Ben-Gurion. If the Arabs in Israel form 40% of the population, this is the end of the Jewish state, but 20% is also a problem. If the relationship with these 20% become problematic, the state is entitled to employ extreme measures. Netanyahu would not further elaborate on any of this. This still also has modern political implications.
Property.
You're from Brooklyn?
No, I'm from New York, from Long Island.
From New York. What right do you have to live here?
The right I have is that the owner of the house wants me to live here, and he wants there to be Jews living in this house, and he wants to, and I got chosen for whatever reason. It ended up being me.
So why do you live here?
Because I live here, because it's important, and because not too many people want to live here, and it's important to strengthen this neighborhood, to make sure that this neighborhood is not lost in any future peace deal.
Your position here is a political position to keep Palestinians out of it.
Not to keep Palestinians out of it, to keep Jews in it.
And therefore keep the Palestinians who are here out of it.
No, that's not, no. That's a necessary evil.
And, that's why I noted it here. This still fuels modern settlers, and it has to be constantly hammered into the minds of most people that are discussing this issue, because this casual nature a lot of settlers have towards displacing the Arabs of Palestine is a horrible thing. Anyway, back to the topic of the Nakba. The Arab Higher Committee would declare a 3-day strike, which would spill into the Jewish business areas, specifically in Jerusalem. Jewish shops would be attacked during this, but after the 3 days, normalcy would come back, as Palestinians viewed this just as a new normal. Historically speaking, Palestinians have been tossed around by various empires, and this would just be a new chapter of a new normal, with being an underclass in a new state. With all of this going on, the Arab public in the surrounding Arab countries were wanting urgent action in the wake of the UN Resolution 181, but the Arab leaders were more hesitant. The Arab League Council would dispatch an arms to the Palestinians and make an all-Arab volunteer force headed by a Syrian general. Later in the month, the Arab force would trickle into Palestine, and this would provide a context for the consultancy, Ben-Gurion's Inner Circle. I haven't mentioned that that's what it is, but because this history is already getting long, I thought you should all know what the consultancy is, but now you all know. This would provide the context for the consultancy to discuss further escalation of the Haganah. All the consultancy would need is a pretext, and that pretext came in the form of those all-Arab forces at one point attacking Jewish convoys and settlements. By December 10th of 1947, Ezra Danin and Yeshua Palmon, members of the intelligence units of the consultancy, would report of members of the urban Palestinian elite would leave for their winter homes in various countries. These people would not return to their homes in Palestine, and it should be noted that not allowing groups of people to return is as much of an expulsion as literally being ran out militarily. Paltisella was also a member of the intelligence unit who was tasked with creating daily reports on the rural life in Palestine, and would learn that the Arabs were to go back to normal. The Jordanian soldiers in the area were to not make any special preparations about any future war efforts, and would essentially conclude in his monthly report of December 1947 that if the people were to be expelled, then this could not be done in retaliation for any aggression on their part, that this was because normalcy was the rule and agitation of the villagers was the exception. Section 4.4, Escalations by the Consultancy. The consultancy would begin engaging in a systematic campaign of intimidation in December of 1947 that would be approved of by David Ben-Gurion. First villages to get hit by this kind of intimidation was Beit Afa and Deir Ayyub, where these villages would be entered at night and be fired at by Haganah forces to intimidate the population into leaving. More stuff would happen like this in other areas of Palestine, like in Qisas, where the Haganah would blow up houses in the dead of night, with villagers in the houses killing 15 villagers, including 5 children, which shocked the New York Times correspondent in Palestine at the time. This correspondent would question the Haganah about this, who at first denied but under pressure would admit it, and Ben Gurion would later make a public apology claiming that the action was unauthorized, but interestingly included in a list of successful operations around April of 1948. If you remember from earlier that event where the Haganah and Irgun rolled barrels of explosives from hilltops down the street and lit the streets afire and would shoot whoever tried to put it out, well, that happens around now, so yeah, moving on. I'm going to skip ahead just because, to go over every village to get expelled would be like 10 videos all on their own. During the turn of the year, an interesting diary entry from Ben Gurion would be entered. There is a need now for strong and brutal reaction. We need to be accurate about timing and place and those we hit. If we accuse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. During the operation, there is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty. So even though there may be some attempts on paper by the Haganah to sort out good and bad Arabs, Ben Gurion seems to not care about this, and this might come up later as something to note. I also think that this attitude of collective punishment that is common to the IDF, where say the IDF demolishes a building where one person became a terrorist and a whole group of people. There's a little example in the citation below. After that entry in the diary on January 9th in 1948, the ALA, Arab Liberation Army, that volunteer army I mentioned earlier, would send its first significant unit into Palestine, but mainly into areas allocated to the Arab state. Generally, these forces opted a more defensive approach, opting to defend Arab villages more than anything else. By the middle of 1948, the consultancy would meet to discuss the implications of the ALA, and it was reported by Eliyahu Sasson that no more than 3,000 volunteers in total had entered Palestine so far, and that if the consultancy did not provoke them, the ALA would stay idle. The mood amongst the consultancy was growing into more hostile forms of intimidation, causing villagers to flee, i.e. ethnic cleansing. Yeshua Palmon on February 19, 1948, would describe in a meeting in Ben Gurion's house that even after they cleansed a village, Sasa, the villagers showed no more wish to fight. Moreover, the ALA was clearly confining its activities to the areas designated by the UN for a future Palestinian state. Ben Gurion would be unimpressed by this because of the limited scope of the operations, and would go on to say, a small reaction to Arab hostility does not impress anyone. Destroy a house? Nothing. Destroy a neighborhood and you begin to make an impression. He would like the Sasa operation because it caused the Arabs to flee. I guess it should be noted that the word tihor, cleansing, in reference to ethnic cleansing, would start appearing more in consultancy meetings and was used in orders passed down to the units on the ground. Do we need commentary for this? Ben Gurion is almost comically racist towards Arabs, and it reflects in his lack of care towards doing just inhumane stuff. Check this out. I doubt whether they, the Arabs, deserve respect as we do, because we did not flee en masse, and so far no Arab Einstein has arisen, and they have not created what we have built in this country, and they have not fought as we are fighting. We are dealing with a collective murderer. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I do not blame you, because geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There is not one single place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. Finally, we are here, talking about the plan that sealed the fate of the Nakba. Talks about Plan Dalet were first discussed around late February. The ALA forces seemed to be making a more gathered effort at attacking Jewish convoys at this point, in early to mid-March, but interesting, this didn't seem to even bother the consultancy that much, and that's probably because they didn't find the Arab forces that much of a threat. The official name of Plan Dalet was the Yeshua Plan, after Yeshua Globerman. Here's a telling quote from a commander to units on the ground around this time of March 1948. These operations can be carried out in the following manner: either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up and planting mines in their rubble, and especially those population centers that are difficult to control permanently, or by mounting, combing, and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the village, conducting a search inside them. In cases of resistance, the armed forces must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders. This order was given out by Yigal Yadin, leader of the Pelmach. By March 1st, every brigade was to move to State D, which was to ready themselves to implement the plans of Plan Dalet. You'll move to State Dalet for an operative implementation of Plan Dalet. This is the opening sentence to each unit on the ground. The villages you capture, cleanse or destroy them, will be decided according to the consultation with your advisors on Arab affairs and the intelligence officers. Just some more fun tidbits that the Haganah were super fans of doing this, I guess. I'm going to move ahead a little to the massacre at Deir Yassin. This is a massacre actually much more commonly known about by most people with at least a passing interest in this topic. Essentially, the Irgun and Stern gang rounded up people after they attacked a village and would execute around a sixth of the population. Now, I could go into the de-Arabization of Haifa, the massacre of Ain al-Zaytun, or the massacre at Tentora, but this would take much too long to go into just one video. Let me summarize this for you a bit. Before the day Israel was founded, May 15th, 175,000 to 200,000 Arabs were ethnically cleansed from the land. By the end of the ethnic cleansing, close to 800,000 people would be ethnically cleansed, which would be more than half of the population, and 531 villages were to be destroyed. And just to note, 531 was around half of the indigenous Palestinian villages. To really get a grip on the sheer scale of this crime, might I recommend Walid Khaldi's work, All That Remains. Just look at this map. All of these dots represent a village that was depopulated. I need you to understand that ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. In a weird way, May 15th is not special in terms of ethnic cleansing. The ethnic cleansing started much before this date and went on much later than this date. But what a better day to choose than the day that the state that would cause us Palestinians to be displaced came into statehood, for us to give the name Nakba to. I want to tell one last story, though, which is going to be a bit more personal. That story is about my family's historical village of Fallujah. It's always weird to talk about my family's hometown because people are like, what? Fallujah? Isn't that in Iraq? And that's just because the guy that actually named Fallujah in Iraq is also the reason that that area in Palestine was also named this. Shahabuddin al-Falluji. Falluji was a Sufi, and as a result, actually my great-grandfather Musa was one, because this village seems to have Sufism as a part of wider culture. Fallujah was founded on a site called Zoreik al-Khandaq, which means blue trench in Arabic. Gotta say, good, cool name, Arabs, just like naming Medina in Saudi, the name Medina. Good choice there as well. Medina just means city in Arabic. Also, let's not forget Zarqa in Jordan, which also just means blue. Okay, enough of me making fun of Arabic town names. I do this a lot, and I probably should not. Anyway, this town's population was 4,670. An attack was mentioned on February 24th of 1948, but no details were given. Later on 14th of March, quoting from the Zionist point of view, that a Jewish supply convoy had engaged in a battle with villagers, and as a result, 37 Arabs and 7 Jews were killed, and scores of Arabs and 3 Jews were wounded. A Haganah demolition squad would be dispatched later that same day and blew up 10 houses. In late October of 1948, the Israelis besieged an Egyptian army brigade led by future President Gamal Abdel Nasser. This brigade would hold out till February 24th of 1949 and would be trapped in what was called the Fallujah Pocket. Eventually signing an armistice agreement, this armistice was also the formal end of the First Arab-Israeli War. By this point, 3,140 civilians still existed in the area. After the Egyptian forces left, the local Israeli garrison would engage in beatings, robbings, and attempted rape, according to the UN observers at the time. Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan would personally reprimand the Israeli army's chief of staff for the acts committed by the Israeli soldiers against the population. Dayan would also go on to say that a whispering propaganda campaign among the Arabs, threatening them with attacks and acts of vengeance by the army, which the civilian authorities will be powerless to prevent. There is no doubt that there is a calculated action, increasing the number of those going to the Hebron Hills as if of their own free will, and if possible, to bring the evacuation of the whole civilian population of the pocket. It was the opinion that the ethnic cleansing of this population was caused by Ben Gurion, and this was going on while the Israelis were feigning outrage over this incident. Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Walter Eitan, would tell U.S. Ambassador James McDonald that Israel had broadcasted repeated reassuring notices to the people in the area, but they acted as if they smelled a rat and abandoned their homes. Eitan said that this was because the Arabs were primitive and rumor-ridden, and that's the end of the story. Israel, after agreeing to an armistice with that area, harassed the Arabs out of the area. Also should be noted that this was part of an ethnic cleansing of another town called Iraq al-Manshiyah that was also contained in the Fallujah pocket. In the future, I want to make a whole video on how the Nakba actually happened, phase by phase, but I'm going to leave you with an incomplete version today. The Nakba represents a watershed moment in history for all Palestinians, the majority of us displaced and scattered in our own diaspora around the world. This moment acts as a collective trauma and is what binds so many of us together. I've grown up around a lot of Palestinians, and just the level of brotherhood you get from each other is wild. But with that said, I am queer and gay and super irreligious and trans, and that has put some bit of a wedge between myself and this community. So, I don't know, I'll have to talk about homophobia and transphobia from fellow Palestinians in another video, because despite a lot of shit, I still don't think committing crimes against humanity against my people is a justified thing to do ever. Intersectionality is a complex thing. I'm going to call it a wrap on this video for now, just because, holy shit, this video is far too long as is, and this is going to be a 2, possibly 3-parter because of just how complex and deep the history is. I had to trim down what I originally wanted to talk about to get to a more workable script. I feel I should note some stuff at the end of this to maybe explain my views more. I know this feels like I'm just, say, shitting on Ben Gurion a lot here, and yeah, I don't like many of the state builders of Israel, but my particular blame is on the British Empire and how it dealt with Palestine. I really like this quote from the 100 Years' War on Palestine, and it kind of encapsulates my view on how I give blame in the conflict. As we have seen, one of the officials most deeply involved in depriving Palestinians of their rights was Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour. A diffident worldly patrician and former Prime Minister and nephew of longtime Tory Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, he had served for 5 years as Britain's Chief Secretary in Ireland, the Empire's oldest colony, where he was much hated, earning the nickname Bloody Balfour. Ironically, it was his government that authored the 1905's Aliens Act, meant primarily to keep destitute Jews fleeing Tsarist pogroms out of Britain. Basically, my own personal theory is that Britain saw this as a way to transfer Jews out of Europe and into the Middle East so they didn't have to think about them anymore. Anti-Semitism has a long history in the world, and when, say, people like Dennis Prageru,
it changed the way that I saw the world. I began to see the suffering of Muslims, including in Britain, as the fault of Western imperialism. The West was at war with us, and the Jews controlled the West.
PragerU focuses on, say, anti-Semitism on the Arab side as the sole thing behind the conflict, which I just want to note, yeah, a lot of Arabs are really racist, homophobic, transphobic, classist, and just a bunch of other things I don't have isms for at the moment. But not to think about how many of these European powers also practice high amounts of anti-Semitic shit as well, like pogroms in Eastern Europe, or say the expulsions in Western Europe, and that isn't an argument for ethnic cleansing the Germans, French, English, Russians, etc. It is only used as a thing to justify the ethnic cleansing of the Arabs, Palestine. And this isn't even going into topics like Occidentalism versus Orientalism, or the most probable colorism present in, say, Jewish settlers towards the Arabs. So maybe I'm just trying to say that the conflicts are really complicated, and to equate everything to just anti-Semitism is maybe a little reductionist. God, I wish I could just like fucking go into like how Judas in the Bible is actually the origin of a lot of Christian-specific anti-Semitism. I don't know, another time. I need to find a way to like shoehorn in some of Bart Ehrman's stuff into a script one day. Oh shit, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, the conclusion of this video. I think a lot of people don't take the time to address this conflict responsibly in this regard, and that's why I noted it. I still have 3 more chapters to cover in my next video, so I guess I will share them with you before I go. But yeah, those chapters are the Israel, David, and Arab Goliath myth. Did the Arabs have a genocidal plan for the Jewish state? And who is preventing peace? Yeah, the next video is going to be a lot of fun. I also just really like talking about the early conflict to this point. I haven't really seen many people really make a super in-depth video about the early part of the history, so that was fun. Anyway, I guess remember kids, the Nakba was real, and if you don't think so, you're probably an anti-Semite against Arabs. I guess if you like this video, like, comment, share, and also if you want to support me in a direct way and have your name at the end of the video, like these people here, feel free to support me. And I gotta put a special thank you to Siegfried Pinzer and Ash Hardell for being my first $10 patrons. Oh my god, what a video. I have probably done more research for this video than like any other video, and like holy shit, like I read like 1, 2, 3, 4, all of this, and all of this. It's probably, I think, like over 5,000 pages of research. This topic just took a really long time, and it's been my longest script so far. Thank you all if you like my work. This was so much fun. Also, please don't just believe everything I just said. Check my sources. I have a Google Doc below with all of my citations, and check that and correct me, please. My next video on Palestine, I would like to announce some corrections at least. This is not going to be for like a couple of, maybe like more than a year, because so this author, Shlomo Ben-Ami, he's a previous foreign minister of Israel, and he was there during Camp David, and he's actually writing a book about his stuff going on at Camp David, and I intend to read that. I don't know what else to say here. I don't know. Bye.